Alrighty, good evening, guys. How are we doing today? Good? I'm very, very excited for today's lecture. I think this is a one exciting topic to actually take a step, I guess, at a high level, look at how websites work, what components make up a site. And today's class is also the first day we're actually going to be writing code. So the past two lectures, we've talked about UI UX design principles. Yesterday, Amanda gave a wonderful Figma demo, Figma walkthrough. I know that there was a lot of content in yesterday's lecture. If anyone ever needs to go back, that lecture is on YouTube. So you can go back, rewatch the whole thing if there's anything you missed from that. But today, we're going to shift gears from looking at UI UX design and how do we mock up a website to build into how do websites actually work, and then starting with some basic HTML today. So first question, I guess, at the highest level possible is what is a website? Can somebody give me a good description of what a website is? Anthony.
So I guess, the web is like a bunch of interconnected networks, and a website might be, I guess, a site on the web. So like one of these networks, sort of. Sorry, I can't go any deeper than that.
Okay. Who else?
I would say it's almost like, in some cases, a connection of pages. Like, if you think of a website, you think of like, oh, you could go on here, but you can also click on like a bunch of different things. So I would say it's basically just a connection of pages that serves some kind of purpose on the internet.
Yeah, a connection of pages. Well, what is a web page then? Yeah?
Structured and organized data.
Yeah, structured and organized data. So I said that at a high level, right, all a website really is a place for people to view information and provide information. So it's this exchange of data, and it's also an interactive way to present content that if you were to give feedback to it, like clicking a link, clicking a button, it's going to respond. We mentioned this idea of a web page, right? So basically a website, all it is it's just a collection of files that your web browser is displaying to you. So you can think all it is a file at the end of the day. But it's a special kind of file that a browser knows how to interpret and display to you. A good analogy that I can give for this is that when you open up Microsoft Word, right, and you load up like a .docs file, it's going to show a Microsoft Word document. So Word is meant to open docs files, PDF files, whatever. If you were to go and try and open a .docx file in Terminal or in Notepad, it's going to look like a bunch of jumbled mess, right? Because it's a special kind of file that Word is designed to open and to present to the user. And a similar thing happens with PDFs. So if you were to go and try and open a PDF file in Notepad or in VS Code or in something that's not meant to open a PDF, it's also going to look like a jumbled mess. The same is kind of true with websites. So similar to how .docs files are meant to be read by Word, PDF files, there's a lot of PDF viewers out there. Internet browsers like Chrome, Safari, Firefox, whatever, they're meant to display websites to users. And if you were to go and open up a website code without the internet browser, you would see something that looks like this. This is the website's code. Now this is human readable, unlike if you were to try and open something like a Word document in Notepad, but it looks vastly different than what we're traditionally used to seeing. And if you want proof of this, if you open up Chrome, for example, and if you've ever hit F12 and you go to Element, this is what the actual web page consists of. So I just hit F12 and Elements, and this is the screenshot of all of the website code. This is what the actual file is. So when we talk about building websites, really what we're going to do is we're going to learn what website code means, what it does, and how to write it ourselves. So hopefully you'll be able to understand the structure of a website, how to write it, and what it does. Those three components. But I think before we actually start writing website code, it's important to have a fundamental understanding of like how a website works and its overall architecture, because there's so many buzzwords thrown around that I feel like myself included a lot of times don't really understand the true meaning behind it. So for example, who's heard of like front end versus back end development? Okay. I would imagine that it's one of those terms like you hear about a lot, but if you were asked to truly define what front end versus back end is, it's hard to define and it's oftentimes a hazy line. So my goal with this is to make sure that everyone fundamentally understands when we're talking about building a website, what we're actually building and why we're doing it. I think that's very important to understand the why behind what you're coding and where it fits into this whole development process. So let's say you want to visit a website, right? You open up Chrome and you want to view, I don't know, georgetown.edu, right? We kind of said that Chrome is like Microsoft Word in that it will render these website files, right? So Chrome is what you open, Chrome renders georgetown.edu, and then you see that georgetown.edu displayed to you. This is like a traditional, typical flow, right? So Chrome renders the site, you view the site, you interact with the site. This is missing an important part. Unfortunately, it's not quite this simple when it comes to actually like displaying a web page. Can somebody tell me what we're missing from this diagram?
I think something about like IP addresses.
Yeah, on the right track. Can someone clarify? Leo.
Where does the file come from?
Exactly, right? So we've heard of the internet, and we know it's a way that data is exchanged, but how does the browser know like what this web page file is, right? Like it doesn't just store all of the information in the world on your computer and just like load a file. Like when you open up Microsoft Word, right, and you click open a file, that file's on your disk and it just loads. It's not the same thing for the internet because the browser needs to somehow figure out what files and what's inside of those files to actually render to a user. And so instead of the browser just immediately rendering files, we introduced this idea of a server. So what happens is when you go to www.georgetown.edu, I'm not going to get into all of the networking behind this, but it'll call your browser will call a server and say, hey, I need the contents for georgetown.edu. The server will decide what files to send back, right? So it'll send back all of the web files associated with that Georgetown.edu. And then the browser renders this site. So we introduced this idea of a server. So instead of the browser just immediately opening that file, calls the server returns this data in the form of these website files, and then you see these website files displayed from Chrome. Does this make sense? So this is like the basic workflow of how a web page is actually fetched from a server. But now we have this question of how does the server determine what to return to the browser, right? So we know that the server is going to return us something, but we don't know what it's going, how does it know like, okay, when the user calls georgetown.edu, what do I give back to the user? And there's two different types of websites that's important to understand the differences between. The first kind of website is called a static website. And all a static website means is that whenever a server's called, so whenever I say, hey, I want the contents for georgetown.edu, the same files and the same content in those files is returned every single time. So it doesn't matter if I were to type in georgetown.edu from my laptop, if Colin was going to type in georgetown.edu from his laptop, if Leo was going to type in georgetown.edu from their laptop, it doesn't matter. It's going to return the same exact files, same exact content. And so in this diagram, it's the same diagram where the browser will request something from the server. The server will respond with a static, unchanging set of files, and then the browser will render these same files every time, no matter the user. And because the server returns the same files every time, sometimes this is referred to as a CDN, which means a content delivery network. And to get a little bit more advanced, the advantages of a static site is that because it's the same content every single time, these networks will cache a lot of servers, and so basically it makes delivery faster. So because it's the same file every time, a lot of times networks will cache the files to a site because it's the same, and it'll load quicker. So we've heard about a static site, and I think a dynamic site is pretty intuitive to understand. It's just not static, right? So a dynamic one is where the server, based on your request, so based on who you are, your login information, what data is available right now, it's going to potentially return different content. And so it's not just going to be like the same content over and over again. We introduce this new step. And so, for example, your browser could call the server, and instead of immediately returning the same set of files it does every time, maybe the server first wants to check if a user's logged in. Maybe the server then will communicate with a database. And maybe, let's say, for example, a social media app, maybe this server then runs a machine learning algorithm to kind of generate a feed. So if you were to open up Instagram, your feed obviously is going to be different than someone else's feed. So if you were to just go to Instagram.com, the content that you're going to see is not the same as the content someone else is going to see. That's determined on the server. And then what happens is based off of all this data, all this code that's kind of run on the server, it's going to respond with a unique set of files and content in those files specific to the user that actually asked for them. And so whatever these files contain depends on whatever the server, like whatever code ran on the server, it chose to display to the user. Does everybody see the difference between a static and a dynamic site? Okay. So obviously we've heard of these terms front end and back end before, right? And I hope that this diagram kind of clarifies what it means when someone says like they're working on the back end or they're working on the front end. So front end is anything that a user sees and interacts with, and this includes UI UX design. And so if we go back to the diagram, this is basically what are those actual files, right? What web page files does a user see? Whereas the back end, it's called back end kind of for a reason, where it's what goes on behind the scenes, right? So you're writing server code. This is what's determining what gets displayed to a user, managing data, potentially running different algorithms. That's the difference between the front end and the back end. So front end is directly what a user sees and interacts with. A back end is kind of what the user doesn't see that determines what they do see. And so the way we've structured Bootcamp is that the first 6 weeks of the course is only going to be in front-end development, which, as we mentioned this past week, has been UI UX design. And then later on in the course, we'll cover some of the basic back-end stuff. So talking about servers, talking about databases, how to run functions on a server, to not just return the same content every time. And so because the first 6 weeks are only front-end, all of the sites that we're going to build are static sites. And so technically, every website has a server, right? So like whenever you go and call like even a static site, like it's still using a server, but it's the simplest form of a server possible, where if you call the site, it just returns a set of files. So there's no logic, it just, you ask for Georgetown.edu and it just returns the same set of files every single time. There's no real notion of like a server, any kind of server-side logic. Nothing's happening uniquely. All of the work is done on the front end. Okay, so I know the diagram was a lot. Does anybody have any questions about any of this? Yes.
So like, does that mean every website is hosted by like a physical like box somewhere, or are there servers like online that host websites?
Every website, yes, it's hosted somewhere.
Like physical? Like
Yes.
servers, like physical?
Are you asking the difference between a cloud-hosted website and a locally hosted website?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. I guess so, yeah.
You or I could host a website right now locally by spinning it up on our box and setting up a server on our box, and then if someone changes our IP address, that would be locally hosted. If we signed into our AWS account, we could make AWS make a box in some server farm somewhere in Virginia,
Okay.
and you'd access that server box. It just is where the box is.
Okay.
Do you have it, or does Google Cloud have it?
Yeah, the way the internet works, there has to be some computer somewhere that is going to respond to your request and say, these are the website files. What we'll get into is when we're actually like developing a website and we're like coding it, we'll run it on our own computer to where like we're able to see it and access it because it's like running on localhost, if anyone sort of localhost. But like you wouldn't be able to like see the website that I'm running in development on my computer.
So let's say I was building a simple website and I wanted to include, let's say, a calendar which would say what day it would be. Was that something that I could do in a static website where it's calling essentially the same separate program every time to get the date? Or could it be something where is that like a backend sort of thing where like it has to like be something that the server really does?
Bruce, this is a great question because there's a difference between static and dynamic sites in the way they're hosted and static and dynamic content. And so I wasn't gonna plan on talking about this difference, but I'll give a 2-minute so I don't oversimplify anything. You could have a static site that has dynamic content. And what I mean by that is the code could be the same thing, anyone that came to the page, it was the same exact code. But let's say in that code, there was a function that called an API. We'll get into APIs later on in the course, but it called a separate server, right? That server is gonna return different values it could return different values depending on user input or whatever. The content that the server of your website that you're using returned is the same every time, but the content that API returns could be different. So technically, yeah, you can have a static site with dynamic content. You can also have a dynamic site with static content. But when we're talking about static versus dynamic right now, we're really talking about is there logic on the server that's changing what's returned to the user at all or not? Yeah. Anything else before we talk about HTML? Okay, cool. So the key takeaway, and this is why I wanted to talk about static versus dynamic sites themselves, is because we're going to start by learning how to code the actual files that a browser renders, right? We're not going to be worried about databases or servers for now. It's only thinking about what files is our browser actually rendering. That's the whole world of front-end development. And so who's heard of HTML before? Who can tell me what HTML, okay, so I'll wait on that question. I've intentionally used the phrase web page files or website files up until now, right? And so my whole reason in doing this is what are web page files? All websites in this world that your browser has ever rendered before are a combination of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So that is what a browser knows how to render. Along with images, videos, assets like fonts and stuff, but like when it comes to code, the only things that a browser really knows how to render are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We'll get into this later on in the course, but there are frameworks, for example, React, which we will be using, that you don't necessarily write HTML. In the compilation process, the computer turns your React code into HTML and vanilla JavaScript code. So what happens is there's this element where people have gotten really clever and said, hey, a lot of times writing pure HTML and CSS and JavaScript isn't that user-friendly and takes a while. Can we make a new language that then we can compile into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that makes developing easier? The answer is yes, and that's what all of these like JavaScript front-end frameworks are. Now this is not true for anything on the server. So there's all different kinds of languages that you can write logic in on the server side. But for front-end development, everything that a browser renders is just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And these three work together in harmony. So HTML is, all HTML is it's just the basic structure and elements of a web page, so the bare bones, right? Like what is physically on the site. CSS is what you add to HTML to make it look visually appealing. And JavaScript is what you add to give it functionality. So HTML is a structure, CSS is a style, and JavaScript is the interaction. And these three all work together, right? Every single web page you've ever visited are just a combination of these three. The front end. And so HTML, it seems like a majority of people have heard of HTML before. is short for hypertext markup language, and it is what's used to create the structure for every website. And so the basic building block of HTML is a tag. And what I mean by a tag is that if you've heard of HTML before, this probably looks familiar. And the basic structure of all HTML elements is the same. You start with an open tag, which is a less than sign, the name of the tag, a greater than sign, the content that goes in between, the content of this element, and then the closing tag, which is the same as the open tag, except there's a / after that original less than sign. So this is the structure of an HTML element. And the whole thing together is called an HTML element. On top of, so the first thing we saw was just a pure element, right? And this happens to be a p tag. For anyone that didn't know, is a paragraph tag. So if you ever want to just write typical text, you'll put it in a paragraph tag. Most HTML elements also have what's called attributes. And so all attributes have a name and a value, and you put these attributes in the opening section of the tag. So after the tag name, so after the p tag, you put a space, and then you put the attribute name, double quotes, and its value. So in this example, this paragraph tag, its ID is top. And I'm sure you're asking, but HTML elements can have as many different elements, or HTML elements can have as many different attributes as you want. And these just go sequentially, you put a space in between them. And so for example, this paragraph tag has an ID, a class, and a style. We'll get into kind of the common attributes throughout the next few lectures. But for now, I just want to get everyone kind of clear on the syntax of a general HTML element. And the real power in these HTML elements is that you can nest elements. And when I say nest, it means you can put elements inside of elements. And this is what creates a full HTML tree. And so every web page you ever visit is just one big HTML tree. And so an example of this, and we'll look at here in a minute or two, some live coding for HTML. This is an example of what's called a div, which stands for divider. These are incredibly useful. And so we could, inside of this div, have an h1 and a p tag. And so this is how a nested HTML, this is a very simple tree, but this is how it works. One very important note when it comes to HTML is that your tags should always be symmetric. And what I mean by that is you should never close a tag if you haven't closed a tag that was made after it. And so for example, you would never put a /div before this /h1 or before this /p. So they have to, it has to make a symmetric tree structure. Otherwise, the browser, you won't actually get an error necessarily in HTML. The browser could just render things weirdly. But in general, this is how you structure all HTML. And so before we kind of go look at some live coding in HTML, I wanted to familiarize everyone with some of the most common HTML tags. Some of them, like input, for example, are very intuitive what they do. Some of them, like A, unless you've coded in HTML before, you wouldn't necessarily know that an A tag is a link. Image, div, p, table. Li is a list item. This is fairly frequently used. But the best way, I think, to kind of learn HTML is actually by doing. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my VS Code. And I encourage everyone to kind of follow along and do this as I go. And so what you're going to want to do is in a file, you want to potentially open a folder or you can create a new folder. And so what I've done is actually, right now I'm working in the Software Development Bootcamp GitHub repo. I would encourage you to create a new folder And then inside of that folder, we're going to create an index.html folder. So you should have a folder inside of that have a .html. I believe if everyone installed Prettier from the first lecture, I believe this is a functionality of Prettier. Tell me if I'm wrong. But if you type an exclamation point and then tab, this should happen. Okay, you might not even need Prettier.
You don't need Prettier for that, I know you don't.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't, didn't have a random extension installed that did that. Okay, so everyone can see this. So this right here is the default HTML tree that just by clicking, by doing the exclamation point tab, VS Code will generate for you. And I hope that everyone sees that every concept that we pretty much just talked about with tags, trees, attributes is present here. Besides from the first line, this weird first line where it's just doc type HTML, which is just what tells the browser, hey, this is going to be an HTML tree. The outermost enclosing element of an HTML tree is HTML. Lang equals en. Does anyone want to take a guess what that means? Yes, it's an optimization. It tells the browser that the language is English. Technically, you don't need that. And then there's the two main things is a head and a body. So does anyone want to take a guess at the difference between head and body? I don't expect anyone to necessarily know. Bruce?
Is head for like a section header text and body for like, I don't know, like almost like a paragraph?
It's a good guess, but no. That's true, yes. Yeah, so anything you put in the head doesn't actually get rendered on the page. What goes in the head is more like, so meta kind of stands for metadata. So this is more like configuration stuff. Next week we'll see how you can include styling into the head, so like it links style sheets to this HTML document. This is where you would like import a font. And so in the head, what you put in the head isn't actually on the page, it's just like configuring the page. The next thing that I want to do is if we go to, everyone should have installed the live server plugin from part 1. In the bottom right corner here, if you say click to run live server, what this is going to do is essentially what I covered in how websites work. It's going to spin up a very basic quote server on our computer that's just going to return this web page, this HTML file. And so if I click it, it should say starting, it'll load up, and you'll see 127.0.0.1, which is just localhost, and then you'll see like a file tree path, and then it should end in index.html. And for now, we're going to get a blank page. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to split screen here, so that I have on the left half, I have the site, and on the right half, I have my code. And then I'm also going to see if I can. Okay. So, and then the body, like I said, right now there's nothing on this site on the left because there's nothing inside of the body. For now, I'm actually also going to disable GitHub Copilot because I don't want it. It's going to probably try and give us like a whole big HTML file tree, and I want to demo kind of some of the technicalities of HTML.
Sorry, how did you get this file?
I just created it. So if you go into Explorer, and good question, I should have shown this. Once you've created a folder, you can create a folder either using like in Finder, in File Explorer, whatever. You can also do it in VS Code. But once you have that folder open in VS Code, you can just click New File and then just name it index.html. Is everybody good? Okay. So if I want to add our first tag, we mentioned an H1 tag. I'm just going to type H1, and if you have VS Code should like autocomplete a lot of stuff for you. So like if you like, I'll demo that again. I think this should be built-in VS Code feature, but if I just type H1 and put that closing thing, it should auto-generate the closing tag, so you don't have to like type out the whole closing tag. And then what I can do is I can just type title of my site, and I'm going to hit save using Command S, and with live server, the site will automatically update on the left-hand side. And so we can see that now you've written your first line of code in HTML, and it's displaying in the browser. If you're wondering what the one, is anyone wondering what the 1 in H1 stands for? Say yes. Someone say yes, please.
Yes.
Yes, okay. There's H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. They're all headers. They correspond to how big they are. So, and these are also heavily used when it comes to like search engine optimization and what Google will like return as the site. So generally you want like the main headers in like H1 tags, subheaders in H2 or H3, like really small subheaders, so on and so forth. But there's H1, there's H2. You'll see it's a little bit smaller. There's H3, et cetera, all the way down to H6. And then, as I mentioned, there's a P, which stands for paragraph. And so if we just type some paragraph text, hit save, that'll be the smallest text we have. And like I said, it's nice that VS Code should color code the opening and closing tags for you, so it's easy to see where you are editing. Okay, so this is cool. The other thing that I want us to all get in a good habit of is the idea of divs. And so as I mentioned, div stands for divider. When it comes to styling in CSS, dividers are some of the most important things to use properly. And the whole idea is that you want to group your content logically. So for example, if we wanted to look at, I'll just pull up right here like a georgetown.edu site. Let's say we wanted to like group everything in the nav bar, right? Like that's a pretty standard thing you would want to do, is like the nav bar is its own like section of the site. So anytime you notice like a section, you want to create a div around it. And so for example, I can come back into my code, and if I create a div, and I'm going to take all of this text or all of this HTML that I just originally written, cut and paste it into this div. And the other thing you'll see is that every time I hit save, if you've installed the Prettier extension, it's like removing random white space and it's aligning everything really nicely. This is what I talked about on the first day. For example, if I were to like add a bunch of like spaces in here, tab this in weird, tab this in weird, and I hit save, it'll all like come back nicely. So as I mentioned, it doesn't change how the div looks right now, or it doesn't change how the content looks, except in the tree, all of these elements are now nested inside of a div. The next thing I kind of want to show is images, right? So most websites have images, and I mentioned that what we're going to use is this img tag. And so in order to actually render an image, there's one required property, or sorry, not property, attribute, and that's src. src stands for source. You're going to put an equal sign, and VS Code should auto-generate 2 quotation marks. Now, what I've gone ahead and done is in the same folder that this index.html is in, I've added this little Georgetown picture. I'm going to demonstrate 2 different ways you can load images onto your site. So the first is locally. And what I'm going to do is inside of this source, I'm going to put a period for local directory and a /. So this means that it's going to look for the source in the same directory that this index.html file is in. And VS Code is going to nicely give me a suggestion that I want to put georgetown.jpg as my image source. And then I'm just going to close it off, and I'm going to close it off with an image tag. I'm going to save, and there's my image. Now, this is really bad form, and I'm going to tell you why. You'll also notice that in the bottom right-hand side of my screen, Prettier is giving me a big giant error message right here. Does anybody know why this would be giving me a big giant red message? That like something is wrong with my HTML. It doesn't, it still renders it. This is what I was talking about. It's not gonna like not compile, right? Because it's not a compiled language. It's just marked, like it's just structure. But this is really bad. Why is this bad?
Is it because you only have access to it, like, because it's in the file on your, like, local desk or your local machine?
Nope, not at all. So that's perfectly fine, and a lot like websites do that all the time. There's nothing wrong with having a relative file path. Henry? Yes, so I kind of lied at the beginning of this class when I said every element has an opening and a closing tag. So in this image, right, there's no content in between the opening and the closing tag, right? It's just like nothing. So it's proper syntax in HTML. If there's no content in between the opening and closing tag, instead of having a separate closing tag, you'll put a backslash in the opening tag itself. And if I save this, Prettier is very happy. And so this is just kind of the notation you want to use if there's no content in between the opening and closing tag. Everybody good? Okay, the next thing that we can do is I'm going to put it above the image because this image happens to be really big, and we're not going to talk about CSS at all today. That's all next week. But above this image, I'm going to show off how to add a link, right? So let's say we want to add a link to this site. So we're going to do an A tag, and the way you actually add a link to an A tag is by the attribute href. So href is where you will actually put the link that you want to visit inside of this link. And so if I just put a link to Georgetown, and then I'm going to close the opening tag, and in an A tag, you do want content in between the opening and closing tag. Can somebody tell me what content we want here? Yeah, what the user actually sees. So I'm going to put go to Georgetown. If I save, we're going to see that over here, go to Georgetown looks like a hyperlink. If I click on it, it's going to take me to Georgetown. The other thing somebody mentioned I wanted to quickly show, this title tag in the head, this corresponds to the document, like the tab title. So if I just wanted to change this to my first HTML site, hit save, that'll update in the browser as well. Okay, now the one, I'll show how we can add multiple properties to an element. So there's a special target, or I just gave it away. There's a special thing where if I click on this link, right, you see how it like replaces my current tab? Like it doesn't, like, let's say I wanted to open a new tab if I click on georgetown.edu, it just instead replaces my current site. If I go into my A tag, into the opening part, and I put target as a property or as an attribute, and inside of it I do underscore blank, and I save it. Now what this is going to do is if I click go to Georgetown, it's going to open up a separate tab. And a lot of times this is what you want if you want to like open up a separate link, but you don't want your website to go away. You'll do a target equals underscore blank. Also, really quick, you can add comments in HTML using an opening tag, exclamation point, and 2 dashes. So this is where I could say, this is my comment. If if I wanted to make sure that people understood what I was writing, and VS Code will nicely gray it out so you don't, like, it doesn't render to the browser, it's just a comment in the source code. So another thing I'll show is how to do lists, right? It's a pretty common thing. You'll see like a numbered list, bullet points, whatever. And so the tag you want to do if you want to make a list of something is there's both a UL and an OL. Can someone guess what the difference between UL and OL is? Yes.
Unordered list and ordered list.
Yep, exactly. So UL stands for unordered list. OL stands for ordered list. And so if I just save right now, nothing shows up. Because inside of these, so you can think of a UL and an OL as kind of like a div, but specifically for list items. And this is what the LI tag was that I showed. So inside of a UL, if you put an LI tag, and I say list item number 1, let's say I want 3 of these, so I'm just going to copy and paste this 3 times. List item 2 and 3, and I hit save, and I refresh, we'll see that that's in a bulleted list on the left. Similarly, if I copy these 3 list items and put them in the ordered list, we'll see that instead of bullet points, these are now numbered 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so far we've covered text, images, lists, links. The next thing I'm going to show quickly is a button. Buttons are very commonly used all of the time. So as you might have seen on the slide before, buttons are pretty self-explanatory. You're just going to put button and then click me. And that'll refresh, and you'll see the button appear right here where it says click me. Obviously right now this button isn't hooked up to do anything, right? And we'll get to this in a couple of lectures, like how do we actually make the page respond if there's a button. If you want a little hint, there's something called an onClick attribute that you would add right here. And this is what like actually makes buttons do anything through attributes like that. We're not going to show that, but if anyone wants to get a little bit ahead, you add like on-click events to buttons and stuff. The other thing we might want to do is we might want to have a form, right? So like let's say we want to get a user's first name and an email, and then they want to be able to submit this form somehow, right? We can create a form attribute, or a form tag, excuse me, and inside of this form, we can put an input tag. And an input tag is going to have a couple of properties. The first property an input has is a type. And if you'll see, VS Code should start recommending a bunch of different possible types of inputs. I want to go with text. So text is like your traditional text box. Inputs are self-closing, which means it's similar to image. There's nothing that goes like in between an input and a slash input. If I save here, so wait, sorry, one sec. But the first thing I'm going to do inside of my form, I'm just going to add an H2, just so I can see on the page a little bit better the separation. We'll notice that there's nothing inside. It's just like this blank text box, right? Where if I go into the site, I can type into this box and add stuff. I want a placeholder. I want to be able to see what I'm supposed to actually enter into this box. And if you guess, it's pretty self-explanatory. Inside an attribute you can add to an input tag is a placeholder tag. And so enter your first name. If I save, that placeholder will come up inside of that input box. The other thing you can do directly is if you want to have a value like already loaded in at the start, you can say value equals like John, and if I save, and it's not a placeholder anymore, it's like the default value of this input box started as John. So those are a couple very common like attributes that you'll use on an input thing, an input element. There's also many different types of input, as I said, so you could have a type, and we just see the suggestions from VS Code if we wanted to do like a date time. I think I have to I'm not very familiar with the date time, but I don't know why that's not auto-populating. If I want to do a type as number, and I save this, you see how it has like the little like clicker, so I couldn't enter like any letters in here, it's only a number that it lets me enter. Similarly, if you want to do like a password field, for example, you could do type equals password, placeholder, enter your password. And what this will do, if anyone wanted to guess, is it'll auto blur whatever things I type into the field. So these are all built into HTML that the browser knows how to render. So when it sees, oh, I want to input with the password, with the type of password, it says, okay, anytime a user enters the character, it's just going to turn it into the little asterisks. And that's how a browser renders that input. Just to get in a good practice of using divs, I'm going to group these ordered lists, or not the ordered list, but the lists. And the habit that I want people to get in, like good practice of doing, is giving divs a class. This will be used all the time when it comes to CSS. Two of the most common attributes that you're going to be using all the time are ID and class. ID and class are both used to identify different elements in an HTML tree. Does anybody want to take a guess at the difference between ID and class? Maggie, what's your guess? Difference between ID and class? It's okay.
I think we cannot use the same ID for multiple tags.
Yep, exactly. So a class can be shared by as many elements as you want. An ID can only be unique to that specific element. So for example, if I wanted to add a class of top text, I'll add a class of lists. And then, just to get a good practice of that. The next thing that I'm going to show is, so we used a relative file path for this image right here. I mentioned there's a second way you're able to actually add an image, and that's by using a link to an image that's already on the internet. And what I'll demonstrate this with is somebody shout out a picture that they want me to put on this site. Like, what should I put? SpongeBob? Okay, let's find a picture of SpongeBob. I like this picture right here. And so we see that, have you ever noticed that if you right-click on an image in Google, you can do something called copy link address? So this image is hosted somewhere on the internet, right? Like there is a link that you could type into your browser. In fact, if I open link in new tab, we'll see that or that's not a good example, but if I copy this image address and then paste it into my browser, like this image is a file somewhere on the internet. And so instead of just putting a relative file path, if I copy this image address and put it, I'm going to add another image tag. Oops. Sorry. I'm going to put it in the double quotes and save, and I come back to my site. For some reason, it is not showing up. Let me see why that might be. I might have done something wrong. Or this site might be blocking.
I was going to say, I think it might be blocking.
It might be blocking it. So I was not planning on getting this today, but there's something called CORS policy, where if I'm trying to access the resource of another website, it doesn't like when people do that. Let me see if I can't find another picture of Georgetown. Let's see if this one works. Whoa, that's a big link. That one worked and loaded into the site. Yeah?
When I put a picture in, it's like super massive compared to all my text.
Yeah, so next class we're gonna talk all about sizing. I'll give a really quick sneak peek. This is like as simple as you can do just to like make it manageable. Inside the image, if you wanted to go style, and I think if you want to do like a width of like 100 pixels, something like that, just if you write it exactly like that, that'll resize your image down to 100 pixels. We're not going to talk at all about like what this actually does today, but basically this is telling the browser to size the image at 100 pixels, just to keep it like manageable. Yeah?
How do you get a new line?
Great question. BR. So, Jesus. I'm gonna take this image out because that is a ridiculously long URL. So you're saying like, if I wanted to do,
Yeah, because like the link is on the same line as the
so if you do a BR just like that, it'll auto close. That'll put it, I can scroll up so it's easy to see, but that'll target a new line. The last thing I was going to show is, so there's a lot of different like things that you can do in HTML. One of them is a table. So if I start with a table tag and a closing tag, if I save, this isn't going to do anything by itself. Tables are structured into rows in HTML. And so if I want a table row, it's a TR. Every table row has a cell. There's a header cell and a body cell. So in my first row, if I want a header, I can put a TH, and that stands for table header. And I can say call 1. If I duplicate this into call 2 and call 3. And then I'm also going to add a new row. Instead of doing TH, I'm going to do TD. I actually don't know what the D stands for off the top of my head. It's just like cell, like a normal cell. And if I do cell 1, and then copy this into 3, and I save, we'll see that this is structured kind of in a table-like view. Some browsers render it a little bit differently, and it'll actually have the grid defaulted to show. Mine isn't right now, but the other thing I'll show, I kind of forgot, this is really simple. The last kind of input type that you should know is a submit type. And so if I just add it like this, it defaults to saying submit. You can also change what the text of a submit input is by the value property. So I can say log in. And if I save that, that'll change the actual text of the button on the left. Anybody have any questions or want to know how to do something, like how to add a new line?
Was Prettier working for everybody, or were people having issues with Prettier?
I couldn't get to work.
Yeah, we forgot to tell you to do something. Reed, can you go to your settings.json? There's some stuff that you have.
For
If you just go to Prettier's extension, it'll show 3 things you have to copy and paste into your settings.json file. So if everybody presses on Mac, it would be Command-Shift-P, and then types in user settings, it'll come up. You'll see a JSON file, which we'll talk about later.
Wait, where do you want me to go?
Do you want me to do it?
Sure.
I can try. Sorry, I just got finished doing this. It's the only reason I know how. Here, man.
Command-Shift-P, it'll get you one of these. So we go to user settings, we go to the JSON file. So this is, Reed's got a bunch of stuff here. See this thing he's got about this line? If you can get that in your JSON file, you can come find me if you're having problems with this. This line will also be if you go to your Prettier extensions in VS Code on the left over here. You'll also see it, the they got the same thing right here. So you'll need to drop that line in. We'll also need to format on save.
Right there.
Editor.format on save needs to be true on line 19 there.
Might be different.
That's the ones that we just used. We dropped both of those in and it worked.
Sweet.
Yeah, if you're having problems, just come find me. I just did this, so.
There you go.
It's gonna be green night has to be these hours. You gotta drop those. It's all gonna be so it has to all be enclosed by the one set of brackets. So if you copy and paste what's on the extension, you'll have an extra set of brackets. Just put the text inside of the brackets. So like from enter that and the end, and it'll probably be a comma.
Yep.
And then
Does anybody else have any questions? I think it was Command Shift P, open user settings.
Command Shift is like the number one best command on Mac VS Code. It opens up like
So I think what you are going to want to have is this. And then you also want editor.format on save to be true. I would just do the HTML one.
yep, exactly. You're missing it. Yeah, so you can.
Okay, if anybody has any questions, feel free to stick around. If not, next Tuesday, we're gonna start learning how to actually make this look good. So as you can tell, right now, this is not how any website on the internet actually looks. So we're gonna get introduced into the whole fun world of CSS, which is how we're gonna make this site look visually appealing. And that's gonna be both Tuesday and Wednesday next week. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to stick around. If not, have a good weekend, and we will see you on Tuesday.